The war was over, but the danger wasn't. There were still mines, still snipers, still chaos. But the tank rumbled forward anyway. It had done it 1,000 times before. When they reached the outskirts of a village, the commander turned off the engine. The world was quiet. Children peeked out from the ruins, watching the soldiers in awe. One of the crewmen climbed out, smiling, and handed a chocolate bar to a little boy. The boy didn't speak. He just smiled back. And in that small moment, after years of destruction, a kind of peace returned to the earth. The crew climbed back into their Sherman. The commander looked at his driver and said softly, "Let's take her home." The engine coughed once, twice, then came to life, just like it always did. They rolled down the empty road, the stars shining overhead, the war behind them, the world waiting ahead. Long after the last tank was scrapped, after the last veteran's voice faded, the legend of the Sherman lived on, in museums, in books, in the hearts of those who remembered what it stood for. Not perfection, not power, but perseverance. The kind of strength that doesn't boast. It endures. The kind of courage that doesn't shout. It simply keeps going. And that's why, decades later, when historians asked those old tankers what the Sherman really was, one of them smiled and said, "It was our home. It was our coffin. It was our miracle." In the end, the story of the Sherman isn't about steel. It's about people, ordinary men in extraordinary times, who climbed into a machine the world doubted, and proved what faith, courage, and unity could really do. The Panther may have been superior, but the Sherman had something far greater. One veteran, Joe Morales, told his grandson decades later, "People called the Sherman a rolling coffin, but when I climbed inside, it felt like armor for my soul. Because I knew my brothers were in there with me." That's what outsiders never understood. The Sherman wasn't loved for its armor or its gun. It was loved because it was alive. In every rattle, every groan, every spark of the engine that refused to die. When museums began restoring the old Shermans years later, some veterans came to see them, standing in front of those green beasts one more time. Most stayed silent. Some smiled. A few cried. A tank curator once said, "When they touch it, it's like they're touching a memory. The steel may have rusted, but the bond hasn't." And that's the truth. Because those men didn't just drive history, they became it. Even now, historians debate the Sherman's design. Was it really good? Was it luck? Was it numbers? But they missed the point entirely. The Sherman's strength wasn't in its stats. It was in its story. It was built by ordinary workers who believed in something bigger than themselves. It was driven by farm boys, factory hands, and mechanics, who learned to fight in a machine made not for heroes, but for humans. It represented a country that didn't always get it right, but never stopped trying. When the last Sherman rolled off the battlefield in 1945, carried more than its crew. It carried the legacy of every man who'd refused to give up. The Germans had built the best tanks in the world, but they couldn't build enough of them. They'd built machines of fear. America had built a machine of hope. That's what made all the difference. As the sun set over the Rhine that summer, a single Sherman crew took one final ride. Their orders were simple: escort a column of refugees heading west. Make sure the roads were clear. When reporters asked soldiers why they preferred the Sherman over the German Panthers they'd captured, the answers were never about specs or power. They were about trust. "The Panther could outgun us," one veteran said, "but the Sherman could bring us home. You could fix it with a wrench and a prayer," another joked. "Try doing that with a Panther." The Sherman wasn't designed for glory. It was designed for reality. A tank that could be built fast, repaired easily, and run on roads the enemy thought were impossible. That's why it won. Not because it was perfect, but because it was possible. When the troops returned home, many left their tanks behind without looking back. They wanted to forget the screams, the smoke, the endless grind of war. But years later, when the world changed again, and people asked them what it was like to fight in those death traps, They didn't talk about fear. They talked about faith. Faith in each other. Faith in the machine that had been mocked, doubted, and underestimated. Just like them. Captain Knight stood beside his tank at dawn, watching the fog roll over the Elbe River. His crew was sleeping nearby, but he couldn't. He kept thinking of the men who weren't there, the laughter that had faded, the voices he would never hear again. He reached out and touched the armor, cold, cracked, but still whole. "You got us here," he whispered. "That's more than most." In the days that followed, the Sherman crews were ordered to halt and wait for transport. Some tanks were loaded onto ships and sent home. Others were left behind, abandoned in fields where the grass would eventually grow around them. The war was done, but their story wasn't. Because for the men who'd fought in them, the Sherman wasn't just a weapon. It was home. They'd slept inside it, eaten inside it, laughed and cried and prayed inside it. They'd cursed it for being too thin, too slow, too fragile. And yet it had saved them again and again. It wasn't the perfect tank. It was the human tank. And that made all the difference. When the last Sherman engine went silent that spring, Europe was quiet for the first time in years. And in that silence, you could almost hear the ghosts of all those who never made it, whispering in the wind, reminding the world what it really cost to get there. When the guns finally fell silent, Europe felt like another planet. The air that once shook with artillery now echoed only with wind, moving through burned-out towns and empty fields where millions had fought and fallen. For the men who'd survived inside the Sherman, it was hard to believe it was really over. They'd lived so long in the rhythm of war, the constant roar of engines, the metallic heartbeat of shells, the smell of oil and fear. That silence felt unnatural. It wasn't peace. It was just the absence of noise. Most crews didn't celebrate. They just stared at their tanks. Machines that had carried them across continents. From the beaches of Normandy to the heart of Germany. And somehow, miraculously, had brought them home alive. Some Shermans were covered in bullet holes. Some had names scrawled across the sides in chalk and paint. Lucky Lady, Iron Angel, Faith. They looked battered, bent, scarred. But so did the men. They'd lost friends in every town, every forest, every crossing. And now that it was over, the silence was filled with the memories of those who didn't make it. They'd seen friends burn. They'd seen perfect tanks die. They'd seen bravery and madness blend together until they couldn't tell them apart. And yet, through all of it, the engine kept running. When they finally reached the Elbe River, word came down the line. The Russians were advancing from the east. The Americans would stop here. For many, that order felt unreal. After everything, the fire, the snow, the blood, they were just supposed to stop. But as they parked their tanks along the riverbank, no one complained. They just sat quietly, listening to the rumble of distant artillery, knowing it was almost done. A few days later, Germany surrendered. The radio crackled with static and disbelief. Some men cheered. Some cried. Most just sat in silence, staring at their tanks. The same machines they'd cursed, fixed, fought, and survived in. One crew climbed onto their Sherman and carved a final message into the armor. "She brought us home." The Sherman was never the best tank. Not by design. Not by firepower. But it was the tank that didn't quit. Because the men inside didn't quit. It became a symbol not of perfection, but of persistence. A reminder that sometimes, in war and in life, you don't need to be the strongest. You just need to keep moving. Through villages where the war had finally ended. Through silence that felt heavier than the gunfire. Through the faces of civilians who watched in disbelief as the tanks rolled by. Not conquerors, but men who'd survived the impossible. As they entered the heart of Germany, the soldiers began to notice something strange. The Panther wrecks, beautiful machines, perfectly engineered, were scattered everywhere. Many hadn't even been destroyed in battle. They'd simply broken down. Their transmissions locked. Their engines failed. Too heavy to tow, too complicated to repair. The Shermans, though battered and scarred, just kept running. They crossed rivers the Germans said were impassable. They climbed hills the Panthers couldn't. They outlasted them not through brilliance but through endurance. Captain Knight, the same man who'd fought at Falaise, stood beside his tank one morning and looked at a destroyed Panther half buried in mud. He walked up to it, touched the cold steel, and said quietly, "You were stronger, you were faster, but we made it farther." He climbed back into his Sherman, and they rolled on toward Berlin. The war was nearly over, but inside every crew, a strange silence had settled. No one laughed anymore. No one talked about going home, because they'd seen what almost over really meant. They backed into cover, circled around, and came at the enemy from behind. The Panther was hiding in a barn, its gun aimed at the road. McAllister's gunner fired through the wall. The shot pierced the fuel tank. The entire barn exploded, a pillar of fire rising into the night. They didn't cheer. They just sat there, staring. The war was almost over, but it didn't feel that way. It never did. By the time they reached Cologne, the city was rubble. Streets reduced to dust, churches shattered, and standing in the middle of that ruin, one lone Panther tank. It was guarding the main intersection, its gun pointing down the avenue, daring anything to move. An American tank destroyer fired, missed. The Panther fired back. One hit, one kill. Then, from a side street, a single Sherman crept forward. No backup, no cover, just courage. It aimed carefully, took a deep breath, and fired. The shot went straight through the Panther's side armor. Perfect hit. The explosion was caught on film. That footage would become one of the most famous tank duels in history. But for the men inside that Sherman, it was just another day trying not to die. After Cologne, the German lines crumbled. The Panthers that once terrorized the fields now sat abandoned by the roadside, engines cold, crews surrendered or gone. And the Shermans, the death traps, the coffins on wheels, were the ones still moving. As the push toward the Rhine began, the air reeked of diesel and cordite. The sky was a dull gray, heavy with smoke from 1,000 burning towns. Every night, artillery thundered like distant storms. And yet the Shermans rolled on, side by side, across muddy roads and frozen fields. They weren't just fighting Germans anymore. They were fighting exhaustion. No rest, no worms, no quiet, just endless motion and the hum of engines that never stopped. In early March, they reached the Rhine River, the last great barrier before the heart of Germany. Every bridge had been destroyed, every crossing fortified. And the Panthers were waiting again, their final stand. The German High Command poured everything they had left into defending that river. Heavy tanks, 88mm guns, camouflaged bunkers, all waiting for the Shermans to try their luck. But the Americans didn't stop. They built pontoon bridges under fire. They ferried tanks across on rafts one by one. Some sank before they reached the other side. Some made it and went straight into battle dripping wet, engines hissing steam. Sergeant Bill McAllister described it best. The Rhine wasn't just a river. It was a wall of ghosts. Every man who crossed it knew he might not come back. But we crossed anyway. His unit faced a Panther ambush 2 miles beyond the river. The first shell tore through his platoon leader's tank like paper. He could see the flash from the other side of the village. Too fast to react, too precise to dodge. Small anti-tank teams with Panzerfausts hid in every ruined farmhouse. Bridges were mined, roads booby-trapped, and every town looked peaceful until you turned the corner and saw the muzzle flash. One Sherman commander, Lieutenant Robert Hayes, later said, "We didn't drive into towns anymore. We crawled. Every street looked like the last one. Until suddenly, it wasn't." He remembered rolling into a small village near Cologne. It looked abandoned, doors swinging in the wind, chickens wandering through the mud. Then a German rocket hit the lead tank. The blast flipped it sideways, the turret torn open like a can. The crew didn't even have time to scream. Hayes ordered smoke and fire on every window. Machine guns roared, flames poured from the barrels, and the whole street disappeared under dust. When it cleared, the enemy was gone, but so were half his men. He sat in his tank, shaking, staring at the wrecks burning in the snow. "We called them death traps," he said, "but they kept us alive longer than we deserved." The Sherman wasn't perfect. Everyone knew that. But it worked. It didn't need special parts. It didn't freeze up in the cold. It didn't break its gearbox after 50 miles. You could pull a destroyed tank off the battlefield, patch it with spare metal, and roll it back out in a day. And that's exactly what American crews did. They became engineers, welders, mechanics, anything to keep the tank moving. Some used scrap doors from destroyed houses to reinforce armor. Others welded spare tracks on the front for extra protection. They joked that the Sherman had as many personalities as it had crews. Every one of them slightly different, slightly scarred, slightly human. They called the Sherman a death trap. And maybe it was. But for thousands of young soldiers, it was also the reason they were still breathing. The reason they got one more sunrise, one more laugh, one more chance to write home. When they crossed into Germany, some of them stopped and looked back, at the black smoke trailing from a dozen wrecks, at the snow still stained with oil and blood, at the tracks in the mud that led them here. And one gunner whispered quietly, "Guess the death trap made it after all." The war was changing. By early 1945, Germany was collapsing. But for the men inside the Sherman tanks, nothing felt like victory. Every mile deeper into enemy territory meant more danger, more traps, more friends buried in the snow. They had survived the hedgerows, the ambushes, the fire, the freezing nights. Now they faced the most unpredictable enemy of all, a dying empire. The roads into Western Germany were littered with wrecks. Panthers with burned-out hulls, Tiger turrets blown apart, half-tracks still smoking from air attacks. But the silence was deceptive, because behind that silence, the Germans were still fighting like cornered wolves. By early 1945, the Panther, once feared, once untouchable, was a relic, too heavy, too costly, too fragile. Shermans rolled through the mud, the snow, the ruins, past wrecks of German armor that once terrified them. And in every victory photo, you could see the same thing: exhausted faces, soot-covered, eyes hollow but alive, standing beside the same tank they once cursed, and now called home. One crew painted words on the side of their tank: "Hell's bus, next stop Berlin." They laughed as they painted it, because they knew it might be their last ride. But laughter was all they had left. Every man inside that tank carried ghosts. Friends they'd lost. Battles they'd survived by inches. Dreams of home they barely remembered. But as long as the engine roared, as long as the tracks turned, they believed they could make it. There's a quote often found scratched into Sherman armor after battles: "For every Panther that kills one of us, 10 of us will come for him." And that was no threat. That was a promise. Because by now it wasn't about pride. It was about ending it. Finishing the war. Going home alive, even if it meant driving through hell to do it. As the Ardennes thawed and spring came, the Shermans pushed east again, through rivers, ruins, and the last desperate lines of the Reich. They weren't perfect tanks anymore. They were legends, scarred, blackened, unstoppable. And as they rolled through the shattered remains of what was once the most powerful army on Earth, the men inside realized something. The Germans had built tanks to win battles. The Americans had built tanks to win the war. In one small Belgian town, a single platoon of Shermans held off an entire German column for 6 hours. They fired until their guns overheated. They reversed down alleys, shooting through walls, dodging fire. And when one tank went down, another rolled into its place. When reinforcements finally arrived, the commander looked at the burned-out hulks and said, "Those men didn't retreat. They just ran out of tanks." Back home, people called them heroes. But the men inside never saw themselves that way. To them, every battle was just another day they hadn't died yet. They didn't think about medals or glory. They thought about keeping each other alive. There's a story about one driver, Eddie Harper. His Sherman took a direct hit. The turret ripped open, flames everywhere. He crawled out, half his uniform burning, then ran to the next tank, climbed up and kept fighting. When asked later why, he said, Because my boys were still out there. You don't leave your boys. That was the spirit of the Sherman crews. You didn't fight for the tank. You fought for the man next to you. Even the Germans began to respect them. Captured Panther crews would shake their heads and say, "The Americans never stop. We kill one, 5 more appear." They called it madness. But it wasn't madness. It was momentum. A nation's will made of steel and sweat. Factories back home running day and night, turning raw metal into machines faster than the Germans could destroy them. The Sherman wasn't better, it was enough. Enough to fight today and tomorrow and the day after that. And in war, that's what wins. When the Panther turned to track it, a second Sherman saw its side exposed. The gunner didn't breathe, just aimed and squeezed. A blinding flash, then silence. The Panther burned. They lost 3 tanks that day, 21 men. But the road stayed open. And the men who survived didn't talk about the fear. They talked about how they beat a Panther with a death trap. "We didn't have the best tank," one gunner said. "We had the best brothers." The U.S. Army learned fast. They started welding extra armor plates. They filled fuel tanks with special liners to stop fires. They trained gunners to hit weak spots, under the turret, through the tracks, from the flank. By the time they reached the Ardennes, the Sherman wasn't just a tank. It was a machine built from blood and experience. And the men inside it had changed too. They weren't green kids from Kansas anymore. They were veterans, quiet, calm, and deadly. Winter came like a curse. Snow covered everything, hiding the tracks, muffling the sound of war. The trees were white, the air sharp and cold. And in that silence, the German counterattack began. The Battle of the Bulge. It hit like a hammer. The Panthers came first, cutting through the snow like ghosts. Behind them, tigers, the monsters of legend. For the Sherman crews, it was hell on earth. Engines froze, radios died, visibility was near zero. And still they fought. Sergeant Tom Rayner wrote in his journal, "The snow makes everything look clean, but nothing about this is pure. Every mile we gain costs lives. But the tank keeps running. She's all we've got." They were outgunned, outnumbered, and half-frozen. But the Shermans did something no one expected. They kept moving. While the German Panthers struggled in the cold, their engines seizing, their transmissions cracking, the Shermans, simple, rugged, American-built, started up every morning with a cough and a roar. Every time a German shell hit, the Sherman's fuel tanks would burst into a roaring inferno. Men burned alive inside metal coffins before they could even open the hatch. It was a nightmare so real that some crews slept with their helmets already on, just in case they didn't wake up again. And yet, every morning those same men climbed back into the same tanks. Not because they wanted to, but because if they didn't, someone else would die instead. The Germans were retreating through France, leaving behind wreckage, mines, and ambushes. Every road was a trap, every field a graveyard, and waiting beyond every hill the Panthers. Their armor was too thick, their gun was too long, their aim perfect. But the Shermans had something else entirely: numbers, teamwork, and pure stubborn will. Captain George Knight remembered one morning near Falaise. "We were told there were Panthers ahead. We didn't even flinch. We just checked our ammo, wiped the mud off the sights, and rolled forward. That's what you did. You rolled forward, no matter what." The road was quiet, just the low rumble of engines and the rattle of gear. Then a flash. The lead Sherman exploded. The column stopped, engines idling, hearts pounding. "Panther, 11 o'clock, came the radio shout. 200 yards. They fired back, shells bouncing off the German armor like pebbles. Then, another flash, another Sherman gone. The smell of burning fuel filled the air. And yet, the rest didn't retreat. They fanned out, firing smoke rounds, pushing into the trees to flank. One tank moved left, then right, dodging fire, using speed as its only armor. That endless rhythm, destroy one, replace one, broke the German war machine piece by piece. Panthers and Tigers ruled the battlefield for an hour. Shermans ruled it forever. Because wars aren't won by perfect weapons. They're won by reliable ones. There's a story from the Battle of the Bulge. A platoon of Sherman crews got trapped in the snow, cut off from fuel and supplies. They knew German armor was closing in, so they stripped one destroyed Sherman for parts and used them to keep two others alive. For 3 days they fought, surrounded, frozen, starving. And when rescue came, those same tanks rolled out under their own power. When asked later how they survived, one of them smiled and said, "Because we had the right kind of junk." That was the Sherman spirit, practical, stubborn, unbeatable. The Germans had science. The Americans had soul. And on those cold European mornings, when the sky turned orange with the first shell burst, you could tell who would last longer. Not the ones with thicker armor, but the ones with something worth fighting for. They called it a death trap. But for the men who lived inside it, the Sherman was the beating heart of an army that refused to quit. It might not have been the strongest, but it was the one that always came back. And that's why, when the war ended, and the smoke cleared, and the world counted who was still standing, it wasn't the Panther, it wasn't the Tiger, it was the Sherman. Because in the end, it was never about the tank. It was about the men inside it, and the country that believed they could win with less, because their hearts were made of more. They called it a victory. Normandy was behind them. France was open. But for the men in the Shermans, the war was far from over. Because now, the real enemy wasn't distance. It was fire. A tank isn't just steel, it's a system. It's the men who build it, the ones who fix it, the factories that replace it, and the nation that fuels it. The Panther was an engineering masterpiece, but it was a diva. It broke down constantly, overheated, and guzzled fuel like a dragon. When it worked, it killed everything in sight. But half the time, it didn't work. The Sherman was the opposite. It was simple, reliable, easy to repair, and it never stopped coming. One Sherman burning meant 5 more arriving tomorrow. The Germans couldn't keep up because America didn't build tanks for perfection. It built them for war. A Sherman crew could change an engine in the field. They could patch armor with scrap metal. If the gun jammed, they'd clear it with a hammer and prayer. No manuals. No waiting for spare parts. Just grit and teamwork. That's what made the Sherman deadly. Not its gun, not its armor, but the 5 men inside who refused to die. A gunner named Frank Dwyer once wrote in his diary, "The tank smells like oil and fear. We keep her running with wire, tape, and luck. But she's ours. When I'm inside, it feels like I'm not alone. Like the whole army's behind me." And he was right. Every Sherman on the front line had an army behind it. Thousands of workers back home in Detroit, welding, shaping, and shipping. When one tank burned, it wasn't a tragedy. It was a message. By dawn, a new one rolled off the factory floor. Inside the surviving tanks, radio chatter filled the air. Flank left. Smoke out. Move, move, move. Their commander barked orders, his voice steady. Not because he wasn't afraid, but because fear didn't matter anymore. They gunned their engines, kicking mud behind them, trying to close the distance before the next German shell landed. The Sherman couldn't outgun the Panther, couldn't out-armor it, but it could outthink it. While the Panther's heavy turret struggled to turn, Shermans darted through the hedgerows like wolves. One tank drew fire, another moved wide, a third crept around the flank. The gunner lined up the shot. A flash, a thunderclap, a scream of steel, and the Panther's side erupted in flames. Over the radio came the voice of the commander, almost disbelieving. "Panther's burning. Repeat, the Panther's burning." For a moment, nobody spoke. Then laughter, rough, relieved, exhausted laughter, filled the channel. Not because they'd killed a tank, but because they'd survived. That night, as they sat on the muddy ground beside their tank, they ate cold rations and stared at the flickering wreck of the Panther in the distance. It was bigger, stronger, beautiful in a terrible way. But it was dead. And the Sherman, dented, scorched, trembling, still ran. That's when one of them said quietly, "She's ugly, but she gets us home." The others nodded. They didn't love the Sherman for what it was. They loved it for what it did. In the weeks that followed, they learned what the Germans never did. They called it a coffin on tracks. A tank so thin, so weak, that a single German shell could turn it into a furnace. They joked that Sherman crews don't grow old. They just melt faster. Even the Germans laughed at it, called it Tommy Cooker, the tank that cooked its crew alive. But what the world never understood is why thousands of young Americans climbed inside that death trap every single day, and why, against every odd, that fragile tank became the most feared, most unstoppable machine on Earth. This is the story of the tank everyone hated but no one could destroy. When the first Shermans rolled onto the beaches of Normandy, the world had already judged them. They weren't beautiful like the German Panthers. They weren't terrifying like the Tigers. They were short, loud, and often on fire. But for the men who drove them, the Sherman wasn't a symbol of weakness. It was a symbol of faith. Faith that when the turret jammed, your buddy would fix it with a wrench and a curse. Faith that even when shells ripped the armor open, someone inside would still get out alive. Faith that this machine, this death trap, was the only thing standing between them and never going home again. A 19-year-old driver named Bill O'Connor once said, "The Sherman ain't much to look at, but she always gets us there, and most times back." That line became the quiet prayer of every tanker in Europe. Because when you fought in a Sherman, you didn't have the luxury of pride. You had to be faster, smarter. You had to think while the enemy aimed. The first time they faced a Panther, it was a nightmare come to life. The German tank sat half a mile away, its long 75mm gun glinting in the sunlight. A single shot, and a Sherman exploded. Another shot, another one burning.